Welcome to the Rebel Educator podcast, where we work to amplify the voices and ideas of changemakers in education. We talk with students, educators, and thought leaders who are questioning the status quo and resisting tradition in education. We invite you to join us as we discuss how to shift the classroom, the learning environment, the mindset, and the pedagogy to try something new, reignite wonder, and reimagine education. If you are in the Bay Area, we are currently accepting applications for students for the fall of 2023. Yes, we have limited spots available, and also for our elementary and middle school, starting at TK through 7th grade for fall of 2024. Up Academy has created our framework so that new and existing schools can develop imaginative, exciting, relevant, engaging learning environments for all of their students. We're excited to introduce the Rebel Project Literacy Curriculum. It's a fully integrated literacy and project-based learning curriculum that supports social-emotional development and is based on skills and competencies. Learn more at projectup.us. Have you ever thought of opening your own school? Project Up is also supporting new educators and families to create schools like Up Academy and schools of your own design. Reach out to join our affiliate network at projectup.us. Now, let's get to today's episode of the Rebel Educator podcast. Welcome, Rebel Educators. I'm here today with Roger Spitz. He is a futurist, author, and president of Techistential, a climate and foresight strategy consultancy. He also chairs the Disruptive Futures Institute, a global education hub empowering organizations and entrepreneurs for disruption. His frameworks for futures intelligence, resiliency, and system innovation have been featured in Fast Company, MIT Technology Review, Wired, World Economic Forum, and Yahoo. With over 2 decades as global head of technology, M&A, and partner in a venture capital fund, Mr. Spitz advises founders, leadership teams, boards, and shareholders on critical decisions amid uncertainty. As an international keynote speaker, Roger has shared insights with influential organizations worldwide, including IBM, Institute of Directors, NASA, Reuters, and Singularity University. He has guest lectured at leading academic institutions such as Stanford and UC Berkeley. He is based in San Francisco, California. Welcome, Roger.
Hey, Tanya. Wonderful to be on your podcast and great to speak for the Rebel Educators. These are very, very important topics.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig in. Roger was kind enough to send me a copy of his book. I have volume 3 of the Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption and Beta Your Life, Existence in a Disruptive World. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit more about that and hear some of your insights and just your personal journey. So let's start there. Let's talk about your personal journey and how it led you into this work.
Great, thanks. Yeah, probably not too many futurists that are kind of ex-investment bankers in M&A, but maybe. So I was born in South Africa and kind of traveled quite a bit as a kid. Most of my kind of schooling was in the French system, actually. I lived in Monaco for a few years, but also in the US and very much the UK university, and then worked in the UK for some time. A lot of the UK is kind of, you end up either a lawyer or an accountant or banker. I did a chartered accountancy, then moved into investment banking for 20 years. So for 20 years, I was basically in mergers and acquisitions, advising CEOs, their boards, shareholders on either their main acquisitions and divestments. And that was great. And in 2017, I had the opportunity to move to San Francisco. And that was the inflection point, not because it was San Francisco, but it was also just a change after 15 years in M&A. I promised myself to move down a rabbit hole around understanding better change, complexity, systems thinking. And that led me to do many micro-learning courses, including in Foresight, Futures, in Palo Alto with Institute for the Futures and Santa Fe Institute, Complexity. And that rabbit hole, after a few years of that, doing 10, 15% of my busy schedule, I realized that I wanted to devote full time to understanding complexity and systems, to understanding decision-making in unpredictable worlds, and decided to move to write a book, to set up a strategic foresight practice. And effectively, that journey led me to also be more sort of externally facing with talks and executive programs, because the topics which were esoteric 5 years ago with the pandemic and other events since became center field. And in particular, sort of understanding that the world is maybe not stable, linear, and predictable.
Want to know one of my biggest frustrations with ed tech? Tools that assume every student learns the same way at the same pace. I need my technology to do more for me. That's why it's so important for me to know that IXL provides true personalized learning across the entire pre-K to 12 curriculum, and that its proven benefit to all student populations, including English learners and students in special education programs. IXL is research proven to accelerate achievement. Studies across 45 states show that IXL schools outperform non-IXL schools on state assessments, and independent research from Johns Hopkins University verifies IXL meets ESSA Tier 1 standards. With those results, combined with IXL's teacher-friendly reputation, what more could you ask for? I'm sure you want to increase achievement for all students. Find out how IXL can help. Visit IXL.com/B for a demo. That's IXL.com/BE. Yeah, if there's anything that's predictable in the world, it's definitely change.
Exactly.
But it's interesting that you talk about learning about complexity, learning about systems, and using that in a very unpredictable world. Because I feel like as humans, we create the complexity, we create the systems to try to create predictability. So can you talk a little bit about how we create systems or how we use that methodology to focus on predictability and change and disruption?
Yeah. So the first thing is our world is complex, and that's great, and that's magical. It's how bees produce honey and cities function, and the magic of the universe. So our world is complex, and that's fine. And actually, humans operate in that complex world all the time. And then, of course, it's helpful with many different aspects of the world to have a more Newtonian, mechanical view of a simplified world you can make assumptions with, and which often are fine. So, how do you send a probe to Mars, or how do you fix a plane, or whatever? And this is what an environment which is kind of linear, stable, predictable. You understand ex ante the outcomes of doing things. It's linear. You understand the drivers that produce change. And, that's the world of known unknowns and experts and science. And that's fine. I think the challenge is that we rely too much on that stable linear world, and the educational system, governance structures, leaderships, incentive structures are all articulated around that degree of predictability. And when you rely entirely on the outcomes of those predictions, that's when you get, yelling at the Fed, sort of saying, despite having the best statisticians and supercomputers in the world, sorry, I thought we could control inflation. We don't have a clue. I thought we knew where we would land. We didn't know. And basically, you then lack the resiliency and systems. So to answer your question as to then what are the frameworks you can have to deal with this, it's first of all to accept that actually the world is unpredictable. And therefore, foresight and futures I found very helpful, because it makes you think about what you're not thinking about, and what are the next order implications, and how do things that might seem unrelated connect, and how to make decisions despite or thanks to that ambiguity. The issue isn't necessarily that that's a challenge to make decisions like that. The issue is that you're not taught how to do it. You're taught the opposite, that data is everything, that you can predict things, that you can just rely on knowledge. That's how you're educated. And you know all this better than me as a real educator. And so for me, the challenge is really changing a number of things around the educational system, around how people think, and to provide them the tools for that. And I can unpack what those tools are if you wish to, as a follow-up question or later in our chat. But the foundations are that it can be done. There are many wonderful ways of doing it, but it's just not the norm. And therefore, we don't develop the habits, the reflexes, the references, the tools to do so, but not because it's insurmountable, but just simply because we're just happy to rely on the Newtonian aspect of the world, which is important for many things, but unfortunately not for everything and not for a lot of what's happening today.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into those tools, especially with a framework of how education can adapt to set up the next generation for success. We do live in a world of constant change and uncertainty. Nothing is set in stone. The world isn't linear. But what that does is it creates more choice and more opportunity for agency. So how can the education system adapt? What tools can we be supporting and teaching our students to really be successful in a world that is continuing to create even more uncertainty?
So you used a magical word there, which is agency, and also you put a tone which is positive to this. And I'm very much in your camp, which is actually, we use often the word disruption, but not necessarily in this sort of technocentric Silicon Valley sense of the word, but more in terms of systemic change. And you didn't use these exact words necessarily, but my read of what you just said is really our thinking, which is it's an opportunity, because if things were completely set in stone and predictable, they would be predetermined. You'd have no freedom, agency, and choice. And the fact that they are ambiguous and indeterminate actually means that you have freedom, agency, and choice. The problem or the aspect or feature of agency is that it's not something that just happens in its own right. It's like an option. Either you exercise it intentionally or it just doesn't happen. And so then what does it mean for the educational system? I think, first of all, it's acknowledging that there are areas where knowledge and expertise will be fundamental, and that's essential, and it's medicine, and it's science, and it's engineering, and it's many aspects of the world. But really shedding the light on these many aspects which are unpredictable, which are complex and nonlinear. So that's starting one, is to be aware, because if your perspective to the world is more, to use Eastern philosophy in terms of, Shoshin, beginner's mind, or transience, Mujo, impermanence, if your framework and your perspectives to the world have an understanding of the multiplicity of possibilities and the limits of our knowledge, and you're going to probably anticipate things and prepare differently for the world than if you're making sort of rash assumptions as to, if I do this, then this happens. So that worldview and those assumptions is what really shapes how your mindset will anticipate and prepare for the world, and then the nature and the timing of responses when different things happen. So really here we're looking at almost just an awareness, a perspective on the world, the assumptions you're making on the world, which need to change. The next aspect, and again, maybe not Eastern philosophy this time, but existential philosophy, coming back to agency, is this realization that you build your essence and you create yourself. And so this indeterminacy and uncertainty is actually extraordinarily empowering, because you have choices. And within these choices, one of them is the choice as to how you challenge maybe worldviews and the assumptions that are made. So how do you learn to challenge those worldviews? And then it's things, of course, like critical thinking. It's things like what is first principles, when you dissect and cut to the basics of assumptions, almost trying to redo something in your own right so you understand how it functions, as opposed to being polluted by, legacy ideas or models or what have you. And then I would say there's a whole area around emergence, because the big difference between, I guess, complexity, where things are not predictable and where they're unknown unknowns, and complicated, where things are tricky, but they're known unknowns, and there are a range of right answers and there are playbooks you can follow. When you don't have playbooks and when they're completely unknown unknowns, you have to rely on trial and error and then emergent behaviors. And that can be taught. The best lesson is really just to give youngsters the experience and reframing what failure is. Failure and innovation go hand in hand, and there's nothing wrong with failure. And actually, to be in trial and error and emergent mode, which is required for unpredictable, complex environments, you need to behave like that. And therefore, if there's any negative connotation or lack of experience and maturing and developing more experimental models because of negative connotations of failure or the lack of given the opportunities, then clearly it's going to be a huge limitation in those unpredictable environments. And so there are many things we can continue to discuss and unpack, but I'll say fundamentally it's that. It's what assumptions do you make about the world and the perspectives? How do you learn to challenge the assumptions and the critical thinking that goes with that? And then what is emergent behavior, and spending time on that trial and error and discovery process and amplifying the things that work, reducing the things that work less well, as opposed to just, oh, where's my playbook that I learned for this situation, because things are not as replicable.
As you're talking about emergent behavior and failure and innovation and trial and error, I often find when I get myself into situations when I don't know what to do next, or there's not a playbook, or my assumptions were wrong and the future hasn't played out, or the conversation or whatever piece of this hasn't played out the way I expected it to, that I often go back to relying on intuition or gut instinct or that emotion or the optimism of what you were hoping to have. So I guess I'm curious, as you've talked a lot about pretty concrete things that we have that we look at and methodologies, but what role do you see as kind of that human form of just intuition and your gut response, or what the emotion of the situation tells you or asks you to do in that situation, how that plays into decision making and into futures thinking?
Yeah, it's a very powerful consideration you're raising. And the short answer is I attribute a lot of importance to it. And I made a big shift over the years because in investment banking, in M&A, and when you're dealing with the market, scrutiny, things are very measurable, and KPIs and returns on investments and all that stuff. And you actually sort of end up believing that that's the only truth and reality and the thing that exists. And now more and more, I realize that the challenge is not so much the lack of data or what the data tells you, but the lack of imagination of what may happen or not. And actually, one of the very significant frameworks I have in our volume 2 in the Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption is articulated around what are the 6 I's to not only be comfortable with disruption, but drive it and thrive on it. And in the 6 I's, one of them is actually inspiration. So I think I have imagination, invention, the impossible, inspiration. I'm forgetting this minute, the 2 others, but these you can see are not your usual kind of strategy playbook things or anything. And in inspiration, there's a very significant aspect, which is also, serendipity, because ultimately, and serendipity, I use it in the, wonderful author and researcher and professor, Dr. Christian Bush, who writes a lot, who specializes in serendipity. And there's some serendipity, you can create your own luck and their own sort of pathways to achieving serendipity. But the fundamental importance for me of inspiration is the degree of predictability is inversely related with the uncertainty. So the more uncertain the environment, the harder it is to predict. And therefore, to your point, and that's kind of how you articulated the question, it's difficult, if not impossible, to rely on specific expected outcomes. And so it's not that inspiration should be a substitute in my mind for science or medicine or anything, but science and medicine pertain to those environments where you can rely on experience, where there is a right answer, where there are known knowns, where it's kind of linear and predictable. And so when you shift to the degrees of unpredictability, unknowability, and the lack of playbooks, it's a very important tool because it's trial and error and emergent. Somehow you need to decide in a way that's not based on experience what you want to amplify that you think might work or get you to the next stage of emergence, and then the feedback loops to sort of see where that brings you. And some things you want to dampen, which you feel are not dampening. And actually, intuition is not a bad way of helping you with that. And then the importance with everything is that it's not a substitute to what science or data or other frames or experts might help with, but they do help when there's really that degree of unknowability. And it is a way of helping you emerge to the next stage. And as long as you build feedback loops, you're constantly then seeing, okay, well, what worked, what didn't work, what makes sense, was my hunch a good one? And again, you're not relying on the assumption of the hunch or the inspiration from a point in time to never altering that and relying on that, because then you're falling on the same trap where that becomes your assumption and you're assuming that your hunch is 100% correct. So as long as you use it in the sort of iterative, emergent feedback loop manner, it's just helping you amplify or dampen things that are kind of trial and error discovery process, if that makes sense.
Yep. And I feel like there's a couple of different notes that I made, both from a framework, one of the frameworks in Beta Your Life, and also the cycle of learning, unlearning, and relearning, and how they kind of fit into there. And I think that's part of what you're getting at with a feedback loop around what are you amplifying, what are you dampening, what's working, what's not working, and how do you unlearn the things that aren't useful, and how do you relearn or find the things that you need to learn. And part of that framework, and one of the notes that I made was around, how do you reframe your existence, become anticipatory, and then exercise agency. And I think we've talked a little bit about the anticipatory and the agency, and maybe these cycles of feedback and learning and unlearning and relearning come together a little bit with reframing our existence. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on how those pieces fit together. And just to throw one more thing in there, as if this question wasn't already loaded enough, what role hope plays in that cycle?
These are all very kind of related. And one of the things I'm a big believer in is, when you start looking at research and studying and even your own experiences, you realize how even multidisciplinary can actually be very specialized. And some of the most brightest people and work and that can be sometimes a bit dogmatic. And one of the things we try and do is kind of almost cherry pick, whether it's our own ideas or other people's ideas, which we, obviously try and attribute appropriately, is that these are often not either or things. So it's, for instance, the discussion we had around emergence is not incompatible with long-term thinking and being a futurist as well. You just need to acknowledge that only the present exists, that you're constantly adjusting and finding a way of reconciling the long term with the short term, and etc. So these are indeed very intimately related. I think in relation to education, and obviously this is your work and your life and the nature and the topic of the podcast, it's interesting to take it in the broadest possible sense, because if we follow what we're saying that things are constantly changing, that there are no playbooks, and that is constantly trial and error. But that applies not just to education at school, but in the boardroom, for me today, for you, for everyone. And I was listening a few weeks ago to a talk, I think, by a government official of Singapore, and I don't know whether it's voted as legislation or being submitted as a draft, but effectively Singapore is busy incentivizing very significantly with scholarships, subsidies, almost as a matter of right for all Singaporeans, I think above 40, if I'm not mistaken, to go back to school, to learn, to have a certain amount of credits and that. And myself, I'm actually currently, as we speak, part of the Fellowship of Climate Base to understand more about climate, and I'm learning, and it's structured education in a sense. And one of the things I do in my work, I'm part of a global Foresight network with the World Economic Forum. And I see a lot of attendees come from countries like Finland and Singapore at the government level who feed directly into the Prime Minister's office, in the case of Singapore and others. And you can see this countries that are quite forward thinking in terms of education and systems thinking and futures, and how it links to building capacity for foresight and how it's linked to education. And part of it is building resiliency for some of the topics we're talking about. So I do think that these are all very linked. And the final comment around hope comes back to agency and to existentialism, is that I actually genuinely believe, I believed this as a kid when I was 15, reading and discovering Sartre for the first time. I genuinely believe that it's precisely thanks to uncertainty or disruption in the broader sense and change that we have the freedom, agency, and choice. We exist. Existence precedes the essence. When Jean-Paul Sartre articulates that, building on the minds of Kierkegaard and others, he's really saying that you exist in the world and then build your beingness. And that essence is effectively the trial and error, the emergence. If it weren't that, things would be predetermined. If you go to this school, this is the outcome. If you speak that, this is the outcome. If you look like this, that is the outcome. Things would be predetermined. So the way I look at it, linking then again existentialist philosophy with agency, hope, and then Eastern philosophy, is that the challenge is not necessarily the world or change in that. It's really the way we see the world, and therefore the way we prepare for the world, and therefore the way we respond for the world. And that's where your role and education and educators are so important, because we're not going to change the way the world functions, but we can change the way human beings operate in that world. And the broader and more appropriate perspectives we have about the world, those worldviews and assumptions will then inform the mindsets we have, how anticipatory we are, how we prepare, and how we respond to things. So it's all very linked, to my mind.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of the big challenges in education, is that linear thinking, and working to be a competency-based school and build skills in students while fighting against a system who says, if you get good grades and get into a good college, you'll get a good job. This linear track of things that leads to success and leading to jobs that may not even exist by the time our kindergartners get through that college, right? And so how are we not only shifting our education system, but also shifting the mindset and the thinking of the parents who are leading their children in to be able to look at a much broader view of what's going to be possible in the world?
Yeah. Completely. And again, for me, these are not mutually exclusive. So it's not because you're including everything we've talked about into the educational system, that you're saying that you shouldn't teach medicine and science and engineering. That's with the false dichotomies and debates of the world that I really do not understand. These are not mutually exclusive. These are not either or decisions. So why would you not increase the relevancy of education by thinking about that? Because it shouldn't be taking anything away.
Have you seen systems or worked with systems that are doing that well?
So yes and no. I would say the first thing about systems and complexity is that, when you push something, you don't necessarily know how it will change, right? It sort of has a degree of unpredictability. So the Amazon, river, or if you put a hotel somewhere and you think you can anticipate how it will change, by definition, you have no idea. It's unpredictable. So it's tricky to kind of know precisely. Having said that, there's a lot of work by people like Donald Meadows and others who look at levers of change and who, look at what are the levers that are more effective in driving change in complex systems. And, coming back to pretty much 95% of our conversation just now, no surprise, education and worldviews are the greatest and most effective levers to drive change, more than incentives or structures or tax or whatever. So the first thing is, yes, there is a way of understanding what levers are most effective. And then the second thing is there's a lot of work being done. So at the school level, for instance, when we initially met with Dr. Peter Bishop, he's the founder of Teach the Future, and I'm on the board of Teach the Future. And that is, instilling basically some things we're talking about in a very user-friendly, easy way into the educational system. And that is a way where educators, without too much investments or changing the syllabus or anything, can instill this kind of thinking in schools. They have chapters throughout the world that are creating change in the educational system in many, many regions across the world. I think that's very effective. And then at a more institutional level, they're not the only ones, there are many others. But I think World Economic Forum, I know it has a slight institutional and corporate flavor, but it's still very important in forming the minds of, leaderships and organizations. The effort of Global Foresight Network, which I'm part of, for instance, is really to try and help build resiliency and capacity building for foresight. And, whether it's effective or not, I think it is effective. But the question is whether enough organizations are following those principles in a meaningful way to move the needle, as opposed to whether those initiatives are effective. So then the question of what's the tipping point, the virtuous tipping points to make the world move the needle because we're doing enough of them. So I think all of these initiatives are, in my mind, very effective and essential. But then to move the needle at the world scale for climate, for societal challenges and geopolitical and others, that's not enough just to have a few, it's like the pandemic. You can't address it by having a few countries that are doing the right thing.
You have a new book coming out called Disruptive with Impact, Achieve Business Success in an Unpredictable World. Can you talk a little bit about what led you to write this book and create this book and how it's designed to help your readers?
Thanks for asking, indeed. So it's coming out after the summer and the sort of Western summer, so September. There's always a tension between the words we use and what we mean and how things are interpreted. So disrupt, again, we're using it as a systemic disruption. And the idea of disrupt with impact is not so much the disruptiveness, but the ability to ignite hope, to unlock new possibilities, and to catalyze positive transformations across systems. So how do you make those changes with impact and acknowledging the unpredictability of the world? So very much talking about the topics we've been touching upon, but in the broader sphere beyond just education. And I guess the reason for writing it and trying to get the word out there is that we built, like you kindly mentioned earlier, a lot of content around guidebooks and frameworks and educational programs and all kind of things. And we're scaling very nicely. And we're seeing a huge amount of demand for people who may not consume a detailed 500-page guidebook, or people who may not go to those programs. And so I got so much positive reception and people reaching out that I thought it could just be helpful maybe to put a 250-pager of a more conventional nature that can also be an audio book, trying to just simplify, focus on the key elements. And then for those who want to unpack it in a particular way, they can do that. But for those who just want to listen to the fundamentals and be able to have it as a sort of straightforward, more storytelling and audiobook, to do that. The focus is really on disruption has always existed. What's different now? So some of the things we talked about. How do you drive systems innovation and transformational change, as opposed to the technology, technocentric innovation, systems innovation. What is the future of artificial intelligence, strategic decision-making, and technology? So the impact and interplay between AI and human decision-making to make sure we upscale and not descale our capability of making decisions. And yeah, those are the kind of three pillars which we focus on.
There's one question that I love to ask all of my guests on the podcast, and that's if you can share a story with us that you remember from your elementary school years.
Yeah, so it's a wonderful one. Thank you for asking. So listen to this. I was brought up in South Africa. I also went to school in Houston, Texas. My father was a professor at Rice for 2-3 years. But I also was in the French educational system in Monaco. And what I would just say is that the multiple choice questions and approaches to schools in Houston were not identical to the French educational system, which is more cerebral and all that. And one of the funny anecdotes, I guess, is when I left the kind of more multiple choice environment, and not meaning to be dismissive of the US, but I don't know why, I just feel that it was a bit more multiple choice-y than the French educational system.
Yeah, my childhood was very much multiple choice throughout elementary school. Yeah.
So I got to one of my early essays in philosophy or something. I forget what age I was, probably a teen or something, in Monaco, in the French system, where the question of the essay was, God is dead, discuss. And I think it's a Nietzsche quote. Fortunately, I was quite keen on philosophy and tried to be clever. So I actually produced a condolences card and wrote my essay in the condolences card, which the teacher was receptive to, so fortunately. And actually, I was quite happy with that ambiguity and appreciated the different perspectives. But I can assure you that whether you're versatile or not with the different styles, the contrast is just extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. Definitely being through different systems and seeing firsthand the education system in many different countries. Roger, how can people get in touch with you?
Really appreciate the question. So we're starting to be visible-ish on the sort of general Google. So I think, fortunately, if people Google my name or the institute, which is Disruptive Futures Institute, or some of the works like The Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption or even Thriving on Disruption, a combination of those will probably lead you to websites with all our socials. We're ramping up social media. We're on Instagram. We're trying to upload quite a lot of podcasts. That will ramp up with the launch of the new book. We also think of serializing and sort of bite-sized newsletters, probably on Substack, some of the work from the 4 volumes of the Definitive Guide to Thriving on Disruption collection. So really choose your pick, and LinkedIn. In order of priority, I'd say videos and podcasts, YouTube, and then LinkedIn for sort of day-to-day content, Instagram for those who like more sort of visual bite-size.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a great conversation. Thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for doing this. You have the most important job in the world, Tanya. Thank you so much.
Thank you. That's it for another episode of Rebel Educator. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for spending your limited time with us learning how to be rebels in education. If you'd like to learn more or access our project library, you can go to rebeleducator.com. If you'd like to learn more about our progressive elementary and middle school in the San Francisco Bay Area, check out upacademy.com. Interested in learning more about our Rebel Literacy Project curriculum or launching your own school and joining our affiliate network? Visit projectup.us. And if you haven't read it yet, pick up your copy of my book, Rebel Educator, Create Classrooms Where Impact and Imagination Meet, on Amazon or anywhere you read or listen to your books. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd love for you to leave a review and rate our show so that others can find it and love us too. Look forward to talking to you soon. Keep resisting tradition, Rebel Educators.